Welcome to Inside American Politics by Skoob. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal and troubling days in American political history. What you're about to hear isn't just another retelling of January 6, 2021. This is the minute-by-minute breakdown of how a sitting president's refusal to accept defeat transformed into a violent assault on the very heart of American democracy. This isn't a story that begins on January 6th. No, this story starts much earlier, in the calculated seeds of doubt that were planted months before a single vote was cast. So buckle up, because we're about to journey through the anatomy of an insurrection, from the psychological groundwork laid in 2020 to the terrifying moments when our Capitol building became a battlefield. Let me paint you a picture of election night 2020. You're watching the returns come in, and something strange is happening. Donald Trump appears to be winning in several key states. The numbers look good for Republicans. Then, as the night progresses and more ballots are counted, particularly those mail-in ballots that Democrats had embraced during the pandemic, the tide begins to turn. This phenomenon has a name, the Red Mirage. It's not some mystical occurrence or conspiracy. It's simple mathematics and logistics. Republicans, following Trump's repeated attacks on mail-in voting, largely voted in person on Election Day. Democrats, being more cautious about COVID-19, voted by mail in unprecedented numbers. Since mail-in ballots often take longer to process and count, the early results showed a Republican advantage that gradually shifted as more ballots were tallied. Any seasoned political observer could have predicted this pattern. In fact, many did. But Donald Trump saw something else entirely. He saw opportunity. Instead of preparing his supporters for this predictable shift, Trump seized on the Red Mirage like a man grabbing a life preserver in stormy seas. This wasn't just denial. This was strategic manipulation of a statistical reality to serve a predetermined narrative. The moment those early leads began to evaporate, Trump had his explanation ready: fraud. But here's where the story gets really interesting and really dangerous. Trump didn't just claim irregularities or call for recounts. He declared victory outright, demanded that vote counting stop, and immediately began laying the groundwork for legal challenges. This wasn't the behavior of a candidate concerned about accuracy. This was the behavior of someone who had already decided that any result other than his victory was illegitimate. The phrase "stop the steal" became more than a slogan. It became a battle cry that would echo through right-wing media and militia groups for months to come. This wasn't organic grassroots anger. This was manufactured outrage, carefully cultivated and deliberately amplified. Now let's talk about how this manufactured outrage found its audience. Trump's claims of a stolen election didn't exist in a vacuum. They were amplified and legitimized by a vast ecosystem of right-wing media outlets, social media platforms, and increasingly militant groups. Right-wing media personalities, some of whom privately acknowledged that Trump had lost, publicly promoted theories of widespread fraud. Social media algorithms, designed to maximize engagement, pushed the most inflammatory content to the top of feeds. And lurking in this digital chaos were organized groups like the Proud Boys, groups that Trump, when given multiple opportunities, refused to denounce. Remember that presidential debate moment? When asked to condemn white supremacists and militia groups, Trump told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. Not stand down, stand by. As if they were reserves waiting for orders. This wasn't accidental language. This was a man who understood exactly how his words would be interpreted by these groups. They heard stand by as be ready. And they were. Joe Biden's victory was decisive. The Electoral College margin was clear, the popular vote margin was substantial, and dozens of courts, including judges appointed by Trump himself, found no evidence of fraud that would change the outcome. But in the parallel universe being constructed by Trump and his allies, none of this mattered. In their narrative, the more definitive Biden's victory appeared, the more elaborate and sinister the conspiracy must be. What we were witnessing wasn't just a refusal to concede, it was the systematic undermining of shared reality itself. When facts become optional and truth becomes partisan, democracy becomes impossible. As the weeks passed after Election Day, Something dangerous was happening. What began as claims of irregularities morphed into elaborate conspiracy theories involving voting machines, dead voters, ballot harvesting, and secret algorithms. Each debunked claim spawned two new ones. Each court loss was reframed as evidence of judicial corruption. This wasn't random, it was organized. There were meetings at the White House, coordination with state officials, pressure campaigns on election workers, and a systematic attempt to create alternative slates of electors. This was an organized campaign to overturn a legitimate election, and it was being orchestrated from the highest levels of government. But here's what makes this story particularly chilling. The people buying into these theories weren't just extremists on the fringes. These were ordinary Americans, your neighbors, your co-workers, people in your community, who genuinely believed that their country was being stolen from them. When you believe that democracy itself is under attack, when you believe that your vote has been nullified by a vast conspiracy, when you believe that the very foundations of your republic are crumbling, well, what wouldn't you do to save it? This is how we got to January 6th. This is how thousands of Americans came to believe that storming the Capitol building was not an attack on democracy, but a defense of it. January 6th, 2021, dawned cold and crisp in Washington, D.C. But the atmosphere around the Capitol was anything but peaceful. In the hours before Trump's scheduled speech, his supporters were already gathering, and their mood was defiant, angry, and increasingly volatile. These weren't tourists who had wandered off the beaten path. These were people who had traveled from across the country, many of them convinced that this was their last chance to save American democracy. Some came armed with more than just grievances. They brought tactical gear, zip ties, and weapons. The crowd was a mix of different factions united by a common belief that the election had been stolen and that dramatic action was needed to stop the certification of what they saw as fraudulent results. There were militia members, QAnon believers, ordinary Trump supporters, and people who had been radicalized by months of election denial rhetoric. As they gathered near the Capitol, their chants weren't just about election fraud anymore. They were about revolution, about taking back their country, about stopping what they saw as a coup by any means necessary. Meanwhile, inside the Capitol building, members of Congress were preparing for what should have been a routine constitutional process, the certification of electoral votes. Some Republican members were planning to object to certain state results, which was their right under the law, but the outcome wasn't really in doubt. Joe Biden had won, and the votes were there to certify his victory. But outside, the crowd was growing larger and more agitated by the hour. They weren't there to witness a peaceful transition of power. They were there to stop it. At noon on January 6th, Donald Trump took the stage at the Ellipse, near the White House. What happened next would be dissected by historians, legal scholars, and investigators for years to come. Trump's speech was a masterclass in incitement disguised as political rhetoric. He repeated his false claims about the stolen election, told his supporters that they were fighting to save democracy, and used language that was carefully calibrated to inspire action while maintaining plausible deniability. "If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore," he told the crowd. He urged them to march to the Capitol, to show strength, to never give up. This wasn't a call for peaceful protest. This was a call to battle. But here's what makes Trump's speech so significant. He wasn't just speaking to the crowd in front of him. He was speaking to people who had been primed for months to believe that they were living through a constitutional crisis, that normal democratic processes had failed, and that extraordinary measures were justified. As Trump spoke, you could feel the energy in the crowd shifting. This wasn't just anger anymore. It was purpose. These people believed they had been given a mission by the President of the United States himself. And then came the marching orders. Go to the Capitol. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. At 12:54 p.m., just minutes after Trump finished his speech, crowds of his supporters breached the first police barricades on the west side of the Capitol grounds. This wasn't a gradual escalation. It was an immediate, overwhelming assault on the outer defenses. Capitol police officers, who had been preparing for a protest, suddenly found themselves facing what can only be described as an invading force. The rioters poured through the outer perimeter with shocking efficiency. They weren't confused or disorganized. Many of them knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to do. Within minutes, hundreds of people had breached what should have been secure government grounds. The speed of this initial breakthrough should have been a warning sign of what was to come. These weren't people who were going to be deterred by barriers, warnings, or pleas for calm. They had come to stop the certification of the election, and they weren't going to let a few police barriers stand in their way. As the first barriers fell, something psychological happened in the crowd. The breach itself became proof that their cause was just, that their momentum was unstoppable, that this was their moment. Each barrier that fell made the next one easier to breach. And inside the Capitol, at exactly 1 p.m., Congress was convening to begin the certification process, completely unaware that their building was already under attack. By 1:10 p.m., Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund was facing a nightmare scenario that no amount of planning could have fully prepared him for. The mathematics were stark and terrifying. Over 1,000 rioters were pressing forward against his officers, creating a ratio of 58 attackers for every one police officer. Think about that for a moment. 58 to 1. Those aren't odds. That's a massacre waiting to happen. Sun began making frantic calls for backup. In the span of just 78 minutes, he would make 17 separate requests to the Metropolitan Police Department. 17 calls, each one more desperate than the last. These weren't routine requests for additional support. These were pleas from a man watching his officers get overrun in real time. The communications captured from that day paint a picture of complete chaos. You can hear the desperation in officers' voices as they called for reinforcements, as they reported being hit with metal debris and poles, as they watched their defensive lines crumble under the sheer weight of numbers. By 1:12 p.m., the rioters had seized the inaugural platform, the very stage that had been constructed for Biden's upcoming inauguration. The symbolism was deliberate and chilling. They weren't just attacking the Capitol, they were attacking the peaceful transfer of power itself. And here's the most infuriating part. While his supporters were overwhelming police officers and seizing government property, Trump was still at his rally near the White House, still urging people to fight and march to the Capitol. He knew what was happening. His supporters were following his orders to the letter. The casualties were mounting, the chaos was escalating, and the thin blue line that stood between the mob and Congress was about to snap. By 2 p.m., we had reached the critical moment. Capitol Police had been pushed back to their final defensive lines. This was it. There was nowhere left to retreat. If these lines fell, the rioters would have direct access to the Capitol building itself. What happened next was like watching a medieval siege in real time. The rioters had stolen riot shields from overwhelmed officers and were using them as battering rams against windows. The chants that echoed through the halls weren't just angry, they were bloodthirsty. USA, USA, mixed with Hang Mike Pence, in a surreal soundtrack to insurrection. Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, the man presiding over the certification that the rioters had come to stop, was hastily evacuated by the Secret Service to a basement parking garage. Think about the absurdity and terror of that moment. The second highest elected official in the country, hiding in an underground garage while a mob called for his execution. And get this. Intelligence later revealed that at one point, Pence was just 40 feet away from the rioters who wanted to hang him. 40 feet. That's the length of a school bus. That's how close we came to a catastrophic escalation of violence. It was at this moment that Officer Eugene Goodman became an unlikely hero. In what can only be described as a split-second decision that may have saved lives and changed history, Goodman deliberately diverted the extremists away from the Senate chambers where lawmakers were still evacuating. Goodman didn't have backup. He didn't have overwhelming force. What he had was courage and quick thinking. He made himself a target to protect others, steering the mob away from lawmakers' escape routes and into areas where reinforcements were waiting. This single act of bravery bought Congress the vital time they needed to complete their evacuation. But the building was falling, and everyone knew it. Here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. While everyone's attention was focused on the main battles at the front of the Capitol, a group of Proud Boys, Remember them? Dash had found a vulnerability that law enforcement had overlooked: the inaugural scaffolding. Those structures that had been erected for Biden's upcoming inauguration had created blind spots and weakly defended access points that the Proud Boys exploited with military-like precision. This wasn't random violence, this was tactical thinking. While other rioters were throwing themselves against reinforced positions, the Proud Boys were using the chaos as cover to find a way in through what amounted to a back door. They stormed up vital stairs, bypassing major defensive positions and getting dangerously close to the heart of the Capitol complex. This is what organized extremism looks like: not just rage, but rage with strategy. At approximately 2:15 p.m., a rioter named Dominic Pezzola used a stolen riot shield to smash through a Capitol window. That moment, shield against glass, the sound of democracy literally shattering, became one of the defining images of January 6th. But it wasn't just symbolic. That broken window was the breach that changed everything. Suddenly, rioters armed with flags, bats, and weapons were pouring inside the Capitol building itself. At the same time, senators were being evacuated through hallways that, just minutes before, had been secure government corridors and were now potential death traps. The separation between the mob and the lawmakers was measured not in city blocks or even building floors, but in minutes and footsteps. And once again, Officer Eugene Goodman found himself in the right place at the right time, steering the mob away from evacuation routes and toward areas where help was waiting. His actions didn't just protect individual lawmakers, they may have prevented the complete breakdown of the evacuation process. At 2:44 p.m., we reached the moment that will forever symbolize how close American democracy came to complete collapse. Rioters smashed through the glass doors leading directly to the House chamber, the room where representatives had been certifying the election just hours before. Picture this scene: lawmakers scrambling for exits, the sound of shattering glass echoing through halls that had hosted peaceful debates for over 2 centuries, and armed rioters pouring through the breach like floodwater through a broken dam. In the midst of this chaos, a woman named Ashley Babbitt, a QAnon believer who had traveled to Washington convinced that she was saving democracy, attempted to vault through a shattered window leading directly into the Speaker's lobby. A Capitol police officer, making a split-second decision with lawmakers still in the area, shot and killed her. Babbitt's death was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. For many rioters, the sound of that gunshot was a sobering reminder that their actions had consequences, that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return. But for others, it was fuel for even more rage. While Babbitt lay dying, other rioters had successfully occupied the Senate floor, the same chamber where Mike Pence had been presiding over the certification process just hours earlier. These weren't tourists taking selfies. They were rifling through senators' files, sitting in the chairs of elected officials, chanting treason as if they were the legitimate authority and the duly elected representatives were the criminals. The certification process, the peaceful transfer of power that has been a hallmark of American democracy for over 2 centuries, had come to a complete halt. The Capitol building, the symbol of American democracy, was in the hands of people who believed that democracy itself was their enemy. Meanwhile, outside the building, police officers were fighting for their lives. Inspector Robert Glover's radio communications from that day tell the story of a man watching his colleagues get overwhelmed in real time. His pleas for backup escalated from urgent requests to desperate screams for help. Finally, at the moment when it seemed like all hope was lost, Glover made a 1033 emergency call, the code that means "Officer needs help immediately." It was an acknowledgement that the police had lost their defensive lines, and that without massive reinforcements, the situation was about to spiral completely out of control. The immediate crisis of January 6th ended when reinforcements finally arrived and the building was secured. But the real story of that day isn't just about what happened. It's about what almost happened and what it revealed about the fragility of democratic institutions. We came terrifyingly close to a complete breakdown of the constitutional order. If the evacuation had taken a few minutes longer, if Officer Goodman had made different split-second decisions, if the rioters had reached lawmakers before they escaped, we might be living in a very different country today. The events of January 6th led directly to Trump's second impeachment, making him the only president in American history to be impeached twice. But more importantly, they exposed the dangerous power of the big lie, the idea that widespread election fraud had stolen the 2020 election. This wasn't just a riot that got out of hand. This was the predictable result of months of systematic lies, deliberate radicalization, and the weaponization of legitimate grievances for political gain. The rioters who stormed the Capitol weren't born extremists. They were ordinary Americans who had been convinced that their country was being stolen from them. When you convince people that democracy has failed, you shouldn't be surprised when they abandon democratic norms. As we wrap up this deep dive into January 6th, remember, this story isn't over. That day was more than a riot. It exposed cracks in American democracy, from truth decay to rising extremism. The real heroes weren't behind podiums. They were people like Officer Eugene Goodman and the election workers who stood firm under threat, guardians of democracy in its most fragile moment. But the real test isn't how we respond to crisis. It's whether we prevent the next one. So here's the question. Are we truly listening to what January 6th was trying to tell us? Download the Skoob app now to hear the full story and explore what it takes to rebuild democracy before the next breaking point.